very pleased to have with us Professor Catherine John from the University of Oklahoma. It's a real pleasure to have someone with us with such a range of interests and abilities in interdisciplinary studies, and to meet someone who's so committed to taking that work both into the classroom and beyond it, to share the work that she does with including the communities about which she writes and with whom she works. Catherine is an associate professor of English at the University of Oklahoma, where she's also affiliated with the Film and Video Studies program. She teaches the literature and culture of the African diaspora, film studies, post-colonial theory, and other subjects. She has, in fact, won several awards from the University of Oklahoma, including, most recently, an award for the Outstanding Faculty Member, 2004, and has served as an advisor in the past for the Caribbean Studies Association, Student Association. I think, as many of you also know, we can take some pride today as well as some pleasure, because Catherine is a graduate of BC, and there are many people in the audience who knew her and still know her. We're very happy to have her back. And the title of our talk today is Internal Resources, the Just Society and the Black Literary Imagination. Please welcome Catherine.
is squarely a comparative project in which I'm looking at African American literature and culture and juxtaposing it with African Caribbean literature and culture. And I'm very interested in the question of what I would call civilizational similarities, right? So that's the broad picture. A few things about myself. I went to Boston College. I did my graduate degree at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I was there for six and a half years. And I spent a year at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in their Black Studies department as a fellow. And I've been at Oklahoma for 6 years. And I'm currently on sabbatical leave for a year living in Washington, D.C. And some less academic interests. I currently working with the filmmaker Haile Garima, who made his signature film is the film Sankofa in the DC area, and he's working on a documentary, a 5-part documentary series on the Maroons, formerly enslaved Africans who escaped from the plantations during the time of slavery, and usually went up to the hilly areas in countries like Brazil and Jamaica, and quietly was kept also in parts of the swampy regions of Florida. Anyway, so that's a little bit about myself, but I'm just going to go straight into my presentation. Internal Resources, the Just Society in the Black Literary Imagination. Okay, in a certain sense, my new research is a continuation and development of the ideas that emerged from 2 previous works. My book, which was called Clear Word and Third Sight, Folk Groundings and Diasporic Consciousness in African Caribbean Writing, and an article that I wrote, which was entitled Neocoloniality, Literary Representation, and the Problem of Disciplinary Solutions. The title means absolutely nothing. I'll explain what it really means. Okay, in this article, I stated that sociological and economic analyses of a situation obviously differ fundamentally from literary ones. These disciplinary differences are further compounded by the historic pattern of social science analyses having the status of fact, while literary analyses, categorized as fiction, are frequently valued as cultural artifacts, but dismissed in terms of their potential to posit solutions to complex national problems. The article took the position that certain African diaspora writers who have emerged from the richest aspects of the literary and cultural tradition imagine more sophisticated solutions to the socio-political problems of the region than many social science theorists had been able to do. Some of these texts, the literary texts, hold up a mirror that more accurately reflects the social and cultural processes occurring than many statistical analyses have done. This is further substantiated by the fact that quite a few professors of history and anthropology are increasingly using literature by Afro-Caribbean and African-American writers in their teaching. In order to make my argument in the article, I used the specifics of my analysis. I situated the specifics of my analysis within the Caribbean context, and I compared and contrasted Carl Stone's essay, Race and Economic Power in Jamaica, with the representation of Indians and Africans in pre- and post-colonial Trinidad in the work of Earl Lovelace and Merle Hodge. And what I found was that while Stone's analysis of the relationship between race and economic power was outstanding, his argument suffered from an inability to assess the nature and impact of culture. Hodge and Lovelace, on the other hand, portrayed in their fiction the continuities between the African background and the diaspora experience. While they analyzed the adverse effects of colonialism on the black majority, they also focused on the collective spirit of resistance, one which is fueled by official and unofficial cultural institutions, and which allows members of the collectivity to resist the totality of psychocultural repression meted out by the ruling order. It's a quote from the article. In my current research, I want to further explore the concept of the just society and its relationship to the black literary imagination, while continuing to develop the notion of diasporic consciousness introduced in my first book. The main purpose of Clear Word and Third Sight, the title of my first book, was to establish that in both obvious and hidden ways, a collective consciousness exists among diaspora populations. My goal was to begin to scratch the surface in terms of describing what this looked like in African Caribbean writing specifically. So in the conclusion to the study, I stated, the concept folk groundings, diasporic consciousness, and alternate consciousness mobilized in this study are continuations of ideas prevalent in the writings about cultural life in various parts of the African diaspora. Here my focus has been on some of the literature and culture emanating from the Caribbean region, cross-cut with influences from the United States and continental West Africa. My aim has been to tap into a widely felt but still understudied aspect of the experience, namely the idea that an alternate philosophical worldview, negotiating in and through a range of Western discourses, has continuously shaped the consciousness of various people in the African diaspora in similar kinds of ways. This diasporic consciousness is grounded in the mores and cultural traditions of the masses of black people. In this study, the defining characteristic of this consciousness is shown to be the cultivation and development of internal resources that provide a sense of balance for both the individual and the collective. Proverbial sayings, folk tales and folk songs, poems and oral histories are some of the manifestations of this consciousness that have appeared time and again in the literary writings. The literatures that draw on these cultural practices have attempted to translate and transfer into written narrative the power associated with the spoken word within the multiple contexts of the oral tradition. So this is how I define diaspora consciousness at the end of Clear Word and Third Sight. Now, historically, in Western discourses, the spiritual and the intuitive legacies have been delinked from notions of the rational. But in the diasporic philosophical worldview, I would argue that relative mastery of both intuitive and rational processes is simultaneously necessary. This allows one to comprehend the concept of life force and the dynamic interaction between the positive and negative energy patterns which establish balance in the cosmological order of things and also connect in a practical way to the basic concerns of everyday life. Further, if there's a link between the indigenous cultural practices of our African ancestors and the spirit of resistance that has sustained those of us in the diaspora, then it stands to reason that the social and political transformations that occur within these national and transnational communities will have to negotiate and incorporate the central aspects of these cultural ethos. In this paper, I will argue that in Erna Brodber's work, Louisiana, and Tony K. Bambar's novel, The Salt Eaters, achieving the just society requires a balance between the rational and the intuitive legacies. Put another way, it is necessary to strike a balance between the internal resources or spirit source of a community and a program of action grounded in the wealthy tradition of political resistance historically developed in African diasporic and continental communities. I see these two texts as calling for a union between spiritual and the just society and the notion of collective memory that I'm specifically working within this context. I would then explore how Broadway's Louisiana and Bambara's Salt Eaters both raise questions and depict imaginative solutions to this 500-year quest for freedom and equality. The notion of diasporic consciousness put forth in my work is implicitly premised on the assumption that tangible connections were maintained between continental African traditions and knowledge systems and the cultural ways of being of those dispersed throughout the diaspora as a result of the slave trade. Contributing to this side of the debate in her recent text, Central Africa and the Caribbean, Transcending Time, Transforming Cultures, diaspora scholar and linguist Maureen Warner Lewis states, quote, "It is only possible to arrive at a conclusion privileging a high level of discontinuity if the slaves were conceived of as less persons than things. When analyses of Caribbean life, history, and culture begin on the plantation, this dimension of personhood and identity prior to enslavement is lost, and one is left to grapple with notions of deficiency and pathology." In a complementary analysis, Trinidadian writer Earl Lovelace states, "For the Africans who were brought to the region, the central theme was the struggle against enslavement, and because slavery was essentially a process that denied personhood, the central struggle after the wars and the marronage was for self-affirmation. They struggled to declare the self rather than utilizing property to gain a self." In his analyses of ancient African cultural and civilizational legacies, and specifically in his assessment of the Twa people as hunter-gatherers living in Central Africa, scholar Obatashaka concludes that the just society is one in which, quote, all just males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Exploring both matrilineal and patrilineal societies from all four corners of the continent, he concludes that there's a twin-lineal approach to the male and female power distribution in many pre-colonial clans, families, and societies. By this created term, he seems to want to suggest that unlike patriarchal family structures in Europe, or the idea that matriarchal family structures, wherever they exist, overwhelmingly leaves the power in the hands of the women, the twin-lineal reality that he observed did not leave the power exclusively in the hands of either men or women. Instead, there's an interdependency of each sex on the other to perform some of the primary functions necessary to sustain the group as a whole. Thus, for example, while a particular people may appear to have a family structure that is primarily patriarchal, the control, relative ownership, and the responsibility to work and sustain the land may be passed down exclusively through the female line. Ultimately, therefore, matriarchy and patriarchy did not mean the same thing in pre-colonial Africa as they may have meant in Europe or Asia. Notions of justice seem similarly culturally rooted. Maureen Warner Lewis states that during the period of the slave trade in West Central Africa, quote, "One source of slaves in societies where jails did not exist was legal offenders, those accused of witchcraft, theft, adultery, breaking taboos against the king and their wives, and so on. Others were sold because they were habitually obstinate or deceitful, and therefore infringed their society's code of proper conduct. While these were not the only reasons that slaves were sold, stolen, or captured, even in the height of the slave trade, this description of the society being left reveals an order which takes very seriously acts of injustice. In Warner Lewis's research into Central African beliefs, the way in which the issue of enslavement itself was viewed by peoples and societies in the region reveals yet another layer of difference between Western and African conceptualizations of justice. Warner states, quote, "Enslavement presented itself to the slaves themselves as a type of witchcraft. Already in 17th century Luango, nocturnal witches were believed to, quote, drag off the souls of the dead to slavery and forced labor. To Central Africans, witchcraft was, quote, ambition, hatred, or greed, in addition to, quote, a failure to accept equality. There is oral evidence that the enslaved perceived their captors and owners as thieves, a perception that recurs at the folkloric and popular level, but is absent or muted in the scribal medium, which hardly reflects the views of the subaltern. We need also reflect that theft was and remains a most reprehensible type of behavior in many African societies where thieves are put to death with little compunction. Added to all this, slavery was in the West Atlantic a form of spiritual and physical subjugation, which equated with zombification. One of the powers of witches was to steal a person's soul and force the physical shell to work for its possessor, unquote. Inequality and spiritual imbalance were not seen by Central Africans as part of the natural order, but rather as witchcraft. In Western late capitalist societies, these particular discrepancies are simply described as reality, and thus normalized, with the presumption being that someone has to be on top, someone on the bottom. Man is basically evil when not restrained by society's laws, and this is just the way things are. The naturalization of this worldview is thrown into relative crisis by a definition of witchcraft as, quote, ambition, hatred, and greed. This assessment of things demonstrates that a substantially different view of justice and humanity existed in certain pre-colonial continental African contexts. The importance of this observation and distinction becomes clear when one begins to appraise current notions of power and dominance in the contemporary arena. The idea that the, quote, will to power and the drive to endlessly exploit is simply part of human nature is destabilized as a universal truth which is equally privileged and centralized in all cultures. Whereas certain cultures have historically glorified ambition and greed, others have classified this impulse as the biggest transgressions of societal balance and order. Echoing this sentiment in a folkloric diaspora context, Zora Neale Hurston's description of the folk hero High John the Conqueror expresses a similar worldview as those attributed to Central Africans by Warner Lewis. She states, quote, High John the Conqueror was playing his tricks of making a way out of no way, hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick, winning the jackpot with no other stake but a laugh, fighting a mighty battle without outside showing force, and winning his war from within, rarely winning in a permanent way, for he was winning with the soul of the black man whole and free, so he could use it afterwards. For what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and lose his own soul? You would have nothing but a cruel, vengeful, grasping monster come to power. John the Conqueror was a bottom fish. He was deep. He had the wisdom tooth of the east in his head. Way over there, where the sun rises a day ahead of time, they say that heaven arms with love and laughter those it does not wish to see destroyed. He who carries his heart in his sword must perish. So says the ultimate law. High John the Conqueror knew a lot of things like that. He who wins from within is in the B class. Be there when the ruthless man comes, and be here when he's gone. Moreover, John knew that it is written, where it cannot be erased, that nothing shall live on human flesh and prosper. It's a quote from Hurston. In this wild selection from Hurston's essay, High John the Conqueror, several things are striking. First among them being her use of folkloric expression to describe the cultural values of the population she studies. Notions of justice are invoked in an interesting way in this passage. Profit and greed are disparaged as not only unjust, but ultimately breeding a spiritually bankrupt world order. There's a sense in this passage that morality comes not from man's law, but from an internal and intuitive sense of right and wrong. She states, quote, he who carries his heart in his sword must perish, so says the ultimate law. Moreover, John knew that it is written where it cannot be erased, that nothing shall live on human flesh and prosper. The notion of an ultimate law, as well as something being written where it cannot be erased, once again moves beyond the notion of justice as simply relative. In African diaspora literature, both in the Caribbean and in the US, striking a balance between rational and intuitive systems of knowledge is seen as a way to create a framework for the internal mechanism of a just and moral order to exist. In Jamaican writer Erna Brodber's third novel, Louisiana, the crisis that the main character is faced with forces a reckoning between Western and African systems of knowledge and power. The novel, though fictional, presents itself as an experimental ethnography collected in the field by a student of anthropology. Although the novel itself was first published in 1994, the prologue, written in the form of a note to the reader from the editor of a fictional Black World Press in Miami, Florida, is dated March of 1978. Here, the reader is told that this manuscript is a fieldwork of one Ella Townsend, who was hired by the WPA in the 1930s, trained in anthropology at Columbia, and sent to, quote, retrieve the history of blacks in southwest Louisiana using oral sources. The publisher further tells us that she was rumored to have, quote, Disimpaired with a confidence trickster into storefront fortune-telling in receptive New Orleans. And 40 years after Ella Townsend's descent into the unknown, this manuscript called Louisiana appeared on our desk. The editor's note states that Ella Townsend actually existed and that her last recorded publication was in The Crisis, volume 67 in 1935. The note further states, quote, "The text argues persuasively that Ella came under the influence of psychic forces. Today, the intellectual world understands that there are more ways of knowing than are accessible to the five senses. In 1936, when Ella Townsend received her assignment, it was not so. The world is ready. We are. This manuscript's arrival is opportune, and in more than one way. Here in Louisiana is a mixture of social history and out-of-body experiences. Perhaps a new field of study, what the world needs now. We have subjected it to little editing. What follows then are purportedly Ella's field notes, divided into 6 sections and written from a variety of perspectives. These chapter headings, which indicate to the reader that this is no conventional ethnography, are as follows. I heard a voice from heaven say, first the goat must be killed. Out of Eden, I got over, Louisiana. And finally, then who says Sammy dead? Translated into standard English as who says that Sammy has died. The novel's basic plot, deduced from the chapter-like journal entries, tells us that Ella had been trained and hired to collect an oral history from Mrs. Sue Ann Grant King, born in 1878 and referred to locally as Mammy King. Ella is given a tape recording device to conduct the interviews, and she travels south with her male friend and later husband, Reuben Cole, to St. Mary, Louisiana. Much to her dismay, she finds her subject uncooperative, and after only one session, Mrs. King suddenly dies. Somewhat distressed and a bit annoyed, Ella attends the funeral, but plans to leave shortly thereafter to return to New York. Much to her astonishment, she discovers from Reuben later that at the funeral, she fell into a trance, started shouting, and had to be forcibly transported from the church. What's more, she has begun to hear voices, and she's also now aware that thoughts and statements, which are not her own, are suddenly appearing in her consciousness. She goes into a full-blown psychological panic when she listens to the tape recorder and hears her own voice saying things she doesn't remember, as well as the voice of a third woman who is obviously not physically present during the interview. What Ella hears on the tape recorder is presented to the reader in an abstract, disjointed, stream of consciousness narrative in the first chapter, I Heard a Voice from Heaven Say. Reuben tells her that the townspeople's explanation is that Mammy King, who Ella later discovers had spiritual powers, had passed on her lifeline to her. As her journal notes state, quote, "It was with great reverence and seriousness," he said, "that they were asking after me. They had no problems," he said, "with the shouting and with my violence and my unusual strength. They had seen it all before, or had heard of it. It was quite consistent with the transfer of souls. I was being taken on a journey into knowing and was resisting as first-timers sometimes do. They hoped my travel was fruitful. I was totally embarrassed. And here was Reuben, willing to consider this explanation of the strange behavior which he described as being mine." Ella now has a choice. Her ability or inability to accept the community's explanation for what is happening to her is connected to how she sees the relationship between the rational and the intuitive. Initially cleaving to the exclusively rational explanation of things, she asked aloud of herself, "Do I need to see a psychiatrist?" But she knew instinctively that Western social science had no adequate explanation for what was happening to her, and were she to choose that path, her experiences would no doubt be viewed as some sort of schizophrenic break, and she might end up in a psych ward on heavy psychotropic drugs. Her turning point comes when Reuben says to her, "How unfortunate when we realize that we are nothing more than the people. This was meant to tell me that I was a hypocrite, pretending to take race seriously, pretending to take the anthropological field's sense of itself seriously, but balking when that explanation was applied to my own behavior. That for all my race consciousness, I was making a distinction between myself and the people around me, and who was I?" When she asks Reuben again if he thinks she needs to see a psychiatrist, he's even more adamant that this is something they need to keep to themselves. He tells her, quote, "Although altogether they are different, yet logical systems of knowledge, and your director knows that. Yet I don't think he is ready for this. Once Ella suspends her disbelief and decides to accept the reality of what is happening to her, she realizes that she has come under the influence of two women, Sue Ann King from St. Mary, Louisiana in the U.S., and Mrs. King's good friend, long dead, Louise Grant from St. Mary, Louisiana on the island of Jamaica. These two women met and befriended each other during the late 19th century and helped each other cope through the adversities that they faced as black women living at that time. They both had the ability to communicate with each other telepathically. While Ella had been sent to gather an oral history in which Mammy King was the object of study, unbeknownst to her, she had been chosen by Louise Grant and Sue Ann King to be both the object and subject of their transfer of power. They conclude that she has a little of both their characteristics, and they make the apparently mutual decision to pass on their gifts to her. In their conversations with each other, reported in the first chapter of the text, one says to the other, "This is the horse. Will you ride?" "Will she do?" "Best I have seen." "Will you ride?" "Let's see if she will." Clearly, they have been waiting for an ideal candidate to take up the mantle and carry on their work. At the funeral, Ella realizes that Mammy was a very significant member of the community when she sees the masses of people and the variety of local organizations from all over the country that turned out to pay their last respects. She also discovers later that Mammy was a community organizer who was also part of the Garvey movement. The references to the horse and to riding, similar to the title of the second chapter, which is "First the Goat Must Be Killed," all should suggest to the serious student of indigenous folk practices rituals of possession by deities and ancestors. Unlike Western notions of possession, which are primarily associated with evil, African notions of possession are overwhelmingly associated with good, one way or another. You are seen as blessed if the ancestors or deities ride you, and you are viewed as a vessel that is transmitting valuable information to the community. Ella, even in the midst of her anxiety, is aware of what is happening to her, and she states, "I was going to be, if I was not already, a vessel, a horse, somebody's talking drum." She is then, in a way, the sacrificial goat referred to in the chapter's title. Her old self and her old ways of seeing are sacrificed in order to clear the way for her new path. As it turns out, even her name is symbolic of her transformation. She renames herself Louisiana, which is not only the name of the towns in two separate countries that both of the women who ride her are from, but is also, interestingly, a union of both their names, Louise and Anna. As Louisiana, she has the gift of being able to see into people's pasts. She helps them relive painful and forgotten moments as a strategy for getting over trauma and moving on with their lives. The idea of getting over is not only the title of chapter 4, but is a direct description of how Ella became Louisiana. Once she accepts the gift, she and Reuben moved to New Orleans and studied with one Madame Marie, seemingly a loosely disguised fictional allusion to the real historical figure Marie Laveau, celebrated voodoo high priestess of New Orleans. Marie is meant to teach her how to activate and utilize her gift. Once this happens, she's referred to by the community as having gotten over, and she writes, "I know, too, that there is a name for that state in which your body is depressed into physical collapse and something else is activated, rather like an injection needle is pushed forward and the shell in which it resides recedes. Getting over. I prefer to call it hegemony of the spirit. I had experienced hegemony of the spirit. I could again and would." Brodmer in this novel plays with a lot of historical allusions. Madame Marie calls to mind Marie Laveau. Ella Townsend did not in fact exist, but Ella Baker, black woman activist of the early 20th century, did. Additionally, Ella Townsend's life and story seems loosely based on that of Zora Neale Hurston, who studied anthropology at Barnard, traveled to the South collecting folklore, and crossed over from being objective anthropologist to participating initiate when she went through rites of passage associated with voodoo in New Orleans. Brodmer's deliberate collapse of the subject-object construct in a myriad of ways in this text stages a confrontation with Western, scientific, exclusively rational ways of knowing the world. And as we can see, Ella got much further by claiming the seeming contradictions to objective reason that she confronted than she would have had she resisted. But beyond this, the notion of collective consciousness takes on a wildly visionary new status, since Brodber introduces the transfer of consciousnesses into the equation. What are we to make of this move on her part? Ancestors handing down not just written notes of their struggles, but passing on their thoughts in tangible form. Ella becomes a bridge. Instead of being an objective observer, she makes herself part of the matrix, sacrificing herself in order to allow others to heal. And it seems that the healing is both the point and the lesson, how to heal the fragments and fissures and pave the way for the just society. Nigerian sociologist Ifeoma Dume, in her paper Religion, Literature, and Models of Opposition, strikes a balance between Brodber's theorizations of the rational and the intuitive, while also linking these systems of thought to the concrete need for sociopolitical change and transformation in more overt ways than Brodber's text does. Amadume argues persuasively that the solutions to current conflicts in continental Africa will not only have to be allowed to develop from within, but will also have to engage the current schism between political leaders who are products of a miseducated, divisive, and elitist approach to rule, and the consciousness and realities of the urban and rural masses, who are still connected in a variety of ways to ancestral systems of thought and cosmological approaches to understanding space, time, and circumstance. I'm going to read a fairly long quote, but important quote from Amadume's essay. She says, in traditional African movements, whether social or religious, this includes anti-colonial liberation movements and the independent African church movements. Social classifiers, social mediators, and thinkers step in to contest power and direct action and change. Often, the very center of authority is challenged, resulting in cognito-socio-political adjustments that force a replacement of old cosmological hierarchies or old paradigms with new inventions and narratives. Myth-inspired diviners, prophetesses, prophets, and spirit mediums play these roles. For the African masses and this class of social actors, there's an interconnectedness in their shared values and identities, since all diviner healers must absolutely experience spirit possession. They speak for and work for the spirits, which are part of the universe or cosmos of the imagination of the villagers or peasant masses. One can thus talk of a collective memory. In the context of this collective memory, monologism, pluralism, diversity, and opposition are certainly contested and form part of traditional African philosophies and oppositional discourses. This plurality of discourse provides me a context for strategies and models of grassroots opposition against which I want to reflect on models of 20th century African oppositional heroes in fact and fiction. My aim is to demonstrate the failure of colonialist, elitist intellectual leadership as represented by fragmented personalities to whom one can hardly attribute any collective memories. I will argue that this is so precisely because in turn, these characters divide in a negative way rather than heal, for their power in society is dependent on bloody and non-inclusive leadership, class, and patriarchy, as ambition, fragmentation, and alienation supported by Western imperialism are so detrimentally opposed to traditional collective kinship morality. State power supersedes kinship ethics. This class rules by violence. That's a quote from Amadume. In this selection from her work, Amadume describes both an implied rule of law and a particular kind of social agent that is non-existent in the same way in the Western order of things. As she states, these social agents are, quote, myth-inspired diviners, prophetesses, prophets, and spirit mediums. She calls them, quote, social classifiers, social mediators, and thinkers. She states that they contest power, direct action, and the very center of authority is challenged. This is made possible by the fact that the villagers and peasant masses live in a world in which the connection to spirits and ancestors is an active part of everyday life and belief systems. She tells us that, quote, all diviner healers must absolutely experience spirit possession, and that they speak for and work for the spirits, which are part of a universe or cosmos of the imagination of the peasant masses. What is implied is that spirits don't lie, and this particular triangular dynamic between the spirits, the people, and the diviner healers effectively charts the coordinates of what Amadume defines as collective memory. This is This is very different than notions of collective memory popularly deployed, which may rely on relatively linear narratives of remembered historical events. The concept of time invoked here is triangular or circular, personal, ancestral, and prophetic. When Amadume describes the current neocolonial leadership as fragmented, supported by Western imperialism, alienated from traditional collective kinship morality, and negatively dividing rather than laying a foundation for healing, she ends by specifically describing them as not participating in the rubric of collective memory described above. Their leadership is a product of Western notions of power, which, good or bad, do not have a tangible, dynamic, and transformative connection to the mythic or ancestral memory of the larger society. What Amadume seems to be proposing then is a societal model in which these particular kinds of social agents can play a role in the transformation of these national and transnational communities. Healers as social agents are central to the notions of transformation and change, imagined not only by Brodber, but also by Toni Cade Bambara in her 1918 novel, The Salt Eaters. Both texts are staged around the lives of female characters that have been chosen, willingly or not, to be the catalysts or central figures at a significant juncture in the lives of their various communities. Toni Cade Bambara's first novel seems to be a culmination of the grassroots activism, cultural organizing, and social critique that she was involved in as a writer, teacher, activist, and scholar. In many ways, this work is a social history of the crises facing black movements trying to organize at the grassroots level in the post-civil rights 1970s era. The primary audience, therefore, appears to be those who have been historically committed to this particular aspect of the struggle. The text rhetorically raises the question to the reader of where one was and what specific circumstances influenced the birth of a progressive or radical sociopolitical consciousness. And the questions raised are these. What were you into when they wiped Lumumba out? Or did you ever go past the Audubon ballroom after they gunned Malcolm down? Or where were you when the news came of King, of Ho, of Mao, of Che, of Fannie Lou? Were you wearing a fro at the time they were hounding Angela across the country? Did you raise funds for Mozambique, Angola? Were you part of the movement in DC in '63? Did you help pull the US out of Vietnam, Eritrea, South Africa? Did you wear a Fair Play for Cuba button? Did you send defense funds for Joanne Little, for Inez Garcia, for Dennis Banks, for Russell Means, for the Wilmington 10? One would ask and be asked, where did it begin for you? This ambitious work, then, charts in a certain sense the psychological pitfalls and the larger socio-political pressures that plagued communities and organizations that attempted to respond to these local, national, and international struggles that connected and affected them in a variety of ways. In an ultimate sense, this text seems to be a visionary template, possibly written to assist interested future generations in understanding what they were up against, while helping them to imagine the possibilities of how. At the most primary level, The Salt Eaters is a story of Velma Henry, daughter of Mama May, goddaughter of Sarah Sophie Haywood, mother of little James, called Jabari, wife of James Lee Henry, called Obi, who is the director of the Academy of the Seven Arts, and sister of Palma, member of the Seven Sisters Performing Troupe. The novel is set in Claiborne, Georgia, and the action takes place at the Southwest Community Infirmary, established in 1871 by the Free Coloreds of Claiborne. When the novel opens, Velma, who appears to be suffering from a nervous breakdown, is in the midst of a session with a community healer, Minnie Ransom, co-founder of the Master's Mind, a group of 12 clairvoyant apostles who assist her in her work by prayerfully focusing their energies during the sessions. Bambara's heavily stream of consciousness narrative traverses the mental landscape of various community residents, giving the reader an insider's view of the negative and positive transformation of various black characters. Similar to Trinidadian writer Earl Lovelace's The Wine of Astonishment and The Dragon Can't Dance, Bambara creates a text in which a plethora of cultural institutions developed by the people and influenced by their ancestral history not only exist, but are imagined as vibrant and sustaining. I consider this one of the ways in which these writers imagine solutions to socio-political problems. The action in this novel unweaves over the course of 12 chapters on the one hand, and 2 linear hours on the other. It begins with Velma sitting in a catatonic state on a stool in the center of a room in the infirmary, surrounded by the master's mind, and directly interacting with Minnie Ransom. Minnie takes Velma on a journey through the moments in her life that both created the crisis she's in, while also helping her revisit the empowering moments and hold on to the positive thoughts that will pull her out of her deep and near-deadly depression. Minnie's assisted in her work, not only by her 12 apostles, but also by her spirit guide, Old Wife, a woman long dead, who helped her acquire her own gift of third sight. Minnie is also assisted by the Lua, the deities that mediate an indigenous African cosmological context between the creator and life in the physical domain. While Velma's story is both the foreground and the background of the narrative, we're also given a bird's eye view into the thoughts of Minnie, the healer, Sophia, Velma's godmother, Obi, Velma's husband, Fred Holt, a cynical bus driver passing through the community, Dr. Meadows, a light-skinned doctor alienated from his roots, Doc Serge, former pimp and hustler turned manager of the Southwest Infirmary, Buster and Nadine, a young couple expecting their first child, Campbell, a journalist, waiter, and mathematical genius, as well as Sweet Pea and Donaldson, a sellout and an informant, respectively. We see the positive transformations of the heroine Velma, as well as the young mother, Nadine, who witnesses Velma's shift towards healing and thinks, something important was happening, and she was part of it. Something bigger than the 2+2 way everybody else lived from day to day. Whatever it was that had fallen away from Mrs. Henry's face was showing her another way to be in the world. The bus driver, Fred Holt's story on the other hand, is one of a man finally coming to terms with his past and letting go of the pain and bitterness born of societal disregard and dreams deferred. As Velma begins to come out of the trance and the planets appear to be realigning and dramatically shifting the weather patterns, the narrative states, Fred Holt will remember that something happened to him, happened inside, something he knew no words for, and would not attempt to describe until 6 years later, when his son was finally able to trace him to the resettlement center. Sweet Pea and Donaldson undergo what could be described as negative transformations, born of disillusionment and demoralization. Donaldson is an ex-con who feels he has no chance of being successfully reintegrated into the community or gaining the schooling and training he wants. So he becomes a willing FBI recruit when the opportunity presents itself and sets himself to the task of infiltrating community organizations and gathering information on behalf of the counterintelligence program. Sweet Pea, on the other hand, is a movement chick who joins Slick to find a husband and who describes herself as waking up from the dream of the 60s to the reality of transformation being impossible. As Velma begins to come out of her trance late in the text, she recalls a conversation with Sweet Pea, who was passing through town, claiming she wanted to look in on her old comrades. She says to Velma, "You honestly think you can change anything in this country?" Her anger flaring now, bewildering. "I try to live, so it doesn't change me much," Velma responded. "You'll learn," Sweet Pea snaps back at her. "You'll learn." The concept of the just society shows up in Bambar's text in a variety of poignant quotes and statements made by various characters. Obi, Velma's husband, remembers something her godmother, Mrs. Haywood, said to him. "You have to be whole to see whole," Mrs. Haywood had counseled. He tried to stay on top of all diverse plans and keep the groups with the academy. A deep rift had been developing for centuries, the woman taught, beginning with the move toward the material world and away from nature. Now there was a babel of paths, of plans. There's a world to be redeemed, she warned, and it will take the cooperation of all righteous folks. Throughout the novel, the community in all its complexity is depicted as attempting to create institutions that respond to the specific needs of the folk. The Southwest Community Infirmary is one such place. Other than the healing practices of the master's mind, the other activities include the fusion of Western medicine and the traditional arts, a drug rehab acupuncture clinic, and a liaison with the Academy of the Seven Arts. The infirmary was developed back in the day with the assistance of old medicine people, grannies and midwives, root men, conjure women, and obia folk over the years. The Academy of the Seven Arts, on the other hand, was a place where, quote, the performing arts, the martial arts, the medical arts, the scientific arts, and the arts and humanities were taught without credit and drew from the ranks of workers, dropouts, students, housewives, ex-cons, vets, church folk, and professionals. After Velma's breakdown, cracks and fissures began to occur in the academy along political and spiritual lines. The spiritualists want the Academy to change its name from the Seven Arts to the Spirithood Arts. They want to, quote, revamp the program, strip it of material and mundane concerns like race, class, and struggle. The political hardliners, on the other hand, wanted, quote, the flowing ones thrown out, and more posters of Lenin, Malcolm, Bessie Smith, and Coltrane put up. It seems that Velma was one of the only ones capable of bridging the gap between the two groups. As it turns out, her breakdown appears to be symptomatic of her involvement in both struggles. On one hand, there's a reality of her physical overwork in order to keep the political agenda going. Obi recalls to himself that, quote, Velma had run the office, done the books, handled payroll, supervised the office staff, and saw to it that they were not overlooked as resource people for seminars, conferences, and trips, wrote the major proposals, and did most of the fundraising. It took him, Jan, Marcus when he was in town, Daisy Moultrie and her mother when they could afford to pay them, the treasurer of the board, and 2 student interns to replace Velma at the academy. On the other hand, late in the text, the observant reader discovers that Velma's mental breakdown was not entirely a breakdown at all, but a physical collapse, similar to the one experienced by Ella in Louisiana, as she emerges from the early stages of being endowed with new spiritual powers. For Velma, like Ella, the advent of the gift brings great psychological trauma and disorientation. At the metaphorical center of Tony Cade's novel, however, are an interconnected set of references dealing with the difference between snakes and serpents, and the multidimensional references to the functions and uses of salt. The first reference comes early on in the text when Velma has just decided to participate in a healing session, and she's sitting on a stool, her thoughts racing, thinking about her suicide attempt and the fact that she might have died. Rumor was these sessions never lasted more than 10 minutes anyway. It wouldn't kill her to go along with the thing. Wouldn't kill her. She almost laughed. She might have died. I might have died. It was an incredible thought now. She sat there, holding on to that thought, waiting for Minnie Ranson to quit playing to the gallery and get on with it. Sat there, every cell flooded with the light of that idea and the rhythm of her own breathing, with the sensation of having not died at all at any time, not on the attic stairs, not at the kitchen drawer, not in the ambulance, not on the operating table, not in that other place where the mud mothers were painting the walls of the cave and calling to her, not in the sheets she thrashed out in, strangling her legs, her rib cage, fighting off a woman with snakes in her hair, the crowds that moved in and out of each other around the bed, trying to tell her the difference between snakes and serpents, the difference between eating salt as an antidote to snake bite and turning into salt, succumbing to the serpent. At a later point in the text, Velma's husband Obi is told by his monsieur that he needs a good cry, that crying is good for the eyes, the sinuses, and the heart. Additionally, it helps the body throw off its excess salt and keep balance. Too little salt and wounds can't heal, but too much, and the monsieur leaves Obi to imagine the disastrous effects of going to the other extreme. In the woods with her godparents, back in the day, when Daddy Dolphy is bitten by a snake, Madera Sophie says, "Quick, salt!" And Velma gives her the salt they have brought along in case of precisely such an emergency. Daddy Dolphy eats some salt, while Madera Sophie slits his shoulder and packs some more of it into the snake-bitten area and tells Velma, this helps neutralize the venom. Daddy Dolphy states, however, to neutralize the serpent's another matter. This is the turning point of the narrative. As Velma thinks these thoughts on the stool in the healing session, her ability to make crucial sense of this metaphor appears to be directly proportionate to her ability to pull herself out of the catatonic state. Symbolically, the serpent represents the psychological forces out to destroy the community. Most specifically, the serpent represents being seduced by power, prestige, and material gain, offered up by the dominant society in exchange for one's spirit. The serpent is symbolic of the power that actually breaks the spirit. As Hurston stated earlier, for what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and lose his own soul? You would have nothing but a cruel, vengeful, grasping monster come to power. Velma believed that her lifelong struggle, as well as the struggles of those that came before her, was creating a vaccine, an antidote to fortify the people against the power of the serpent, the seductive lure of living through vanity. But they had collectively failed in some way. They had lost folks along the way, and she had ultimately been pulled under. So what was missing? The strongest principle in diasporic consciousness is that you hold on to your spirit no matter what. if the spirit is strong, then it can be passed on to subsequent generations, teaching them how to survive extreme brutality. We thus become the proverbial salt of the earth, or the salt eaters. It is significant that at the moment of Velma's realization and awakening from her trance, the text reveals that she has some kind of spiritual gift. Her spiritual awakening, combined with her well-developed political consciousness, appears to equip her with the tools to finally bridge the divide between the two warring groups at the Academy. Toni Cade Bambara and Una Brodman's novels are stunningly similar in their uncanny attempts to give birth to prophetic characters who can be the lightning rods for change. In this sense, these two novels are no longer simply social histories or critiques of anthropology respectively, but now are active templates for change. They're cryptic word maps with equally coded solutions to the problems facing diasporic communities. We're being called upon collectively to learn a new language. The healer is at the center of these texts, guiding the balance between rational and intuitive systems of knowledge. Amadume's description of the role that myth-inspired diviners and prophets play in the West African context begs the question as to whether or not this is the missing discursive figure in the West. There is no structure in the West to systematically separate the advent of this way to be in the world from the skeptic abyss of psychiatric disbelief. And what is birthed by Bambara and Brodmann is no static notion of healer, simply as a religious icon with the power to cure. It is instead a multidimensional concept which combines the roles of doctor, politician, community organizer, psychiatrist, and priest into a syncretic mix which spirals, circles, and triangulates but beyond the linear spectrum of time as we know it. Since in my talk I want to force us to develop more of an awareness of the relationship between the rational and the intuitive, by way of ending, I want to show a brief clip, it's about 5 minutes, from Julie Dash's 1992 film Daughters in the Dust. So I want this to function as a visual counterpoint to the concepts that I'm trying to articulate. Let's see. I can think about this.
I visit village, possess every day since that day him dying. It's up to the living to keep in touch with the dead, Eli. Man's power don't end with death. We just move on to another place. A place where we go and watch over our living family. Respect your elders. Respect your family. Respect your ancestors. You don't worry that baby you're carrying ain't John, 'cause she get forced. You won't have no baby that was sent to you. The ancestor and the womb, they the same. Those in this grave, like those who had crossed the sea, they with us. They are the same. The ancestor and the womb. Call on your ancestors, Eli. Let them guide. You need their strength. Eli, I need for you to make the family strong again, like we used to be.
How can you understand me and the way I feel? This happened to my wife. My wife. I don't feel like she's mine no more. When I look at her, I feel I don't even want her no more.
You can't give back what you never owned. You'll never belong to you. She married you.
Why didn't you protect us, Nana? Someone put the fix on me. Was it the ganja? A bad luck? But what you also too deep in the grave to give a gamma. But my wife and some stranger was riding her. was children, we really believed you could work the good out of evil. We believe in the newsprint on the wall, your tree, your glass jars and bottles, the rice you carry in your pockets. We believe in the frizzle-head chicken, the coins, the roots, and the flowers. We believe they will protect us. And wherever they did, we on our love. I ain't been scared nothing. And no one, because I knew my great-grandmother had the ball in her pocket. Or can walk it up.
Never forget who we is and how far we done come.
I believe here. I don't have no other choice.
Eli, there's a time, a recollection, something somebody remembers. We carry these memories inside of we. Do you believe that those hundreds of Africans right here on this other side will forget everything they once knew? We don't know where the recollection comes from. Sometimes we dream of, but we carry these memories inside of we.
What are we supposed to remember, Nana? How we one time was able to protect those we love? And the Africa where we were kings and queens and built great big cities?
Eli, I'm trying to learn you how to touch your own spirit. I'm fighting for my life, and I'm fighting for yours. Look at my face. I'm trying to give you something to take north with you, along with all your great big dreams.
Call on those old Africans, Eli. They come to you with the least speckle. They hug you up quick and soft as the warm, sweet wind. Let them old souls come into your heart, Eli. Let them touch you with the hand of time. Let them feed your head with wisdom that is from this day in time. Because when you leave this island, Eli present, you ain't going to no land of milk and honey.
Eli, I'm putting my trust in you to keep the family together up north. That's the challenge we'll face all you Negro people who are free. Celebrate our ways.
Okay, so one little paragraph. So finally, I would say that the notion of internal resources referenced in the title implies both a supply of energy and the resourcefulness of being creative when one finds oneself in a difficult situation. There's also the idea of returning to the source, reconnecting with the foundation on which one's house is built. In African cosmological world sense, the return to the source implies the connection between the living and the physically dead, a union which is said to occur in cyclic fashion, thus conjuring up the coordinates of a circle. The circle, which is frequently used to diagram this progression, should also call to mind the triangular notions of collective memory, suggested by Ifeoma Dume and imagined by Julie Dash in the clip we just saw from the film Dogs and Dust. Anyway, I'll end with a quote that poetically captures the concept of a just society. At the end of her collection of poems entitled Next, Lucille Clifton's final poem, Metaphysics, is as follows. Question, what is karma? Answer, there is a wheel, and it is turning. Thank you. Yes.
I have two questions, and they're unformed, so I hope you can get the gist of what I'm trying to ask you. The first one is about sort of what happens. I think I understand you completely when you talk about the traces that are the continuous traces traditions of social justice and a different cosmology. But I'm wondering what happens when it is in the diaspora. How does it sort of interact with sort of a U.S. consciousness or a U.S. kind of way of?
But say again,
I think you trace very nicely sort of where the African is in the U.S., particularly when you talk about the salt eaters.
Okay.
Salt eaters.
Okay.
But I'm wondering if you could sort of talk me through the interaction. You know, what happens when this African spirituality is in conflict, but also in harmony, or when it harmonizes with a U.S. kind of world. And I'm thinking of, I'm wondering, if you can give me an example from the salt eaters, because I see the African, but I don't see the harmony between sort of the African and the American.
Okay. And the American?
Yeah, in terms of the salt eaters, I mean, or Western or African, how
Okay.
you want to.
Okay, I'll play with it, and then you can sort of push me further if I'm not answering your question, or if I don't fully understand what you're asking. Well, in the salt eaters, I would say that what's interesting to me about both Brodberg and Tony Kaye's text is that you have all of this. I don't know if this is what you're asking. There's a constant presence, right, of things that normally you would associate with a kind of traditional African spiritual worldview. What's funny to me about this book is that it's kind of like Julie Dash's film. There's certain texts that I've encountered that if you don't understand what they're drawing on, they don't make any sense to you. And you don't even see those parts of the text, you know? And then the more you learn about the larger, context, cultural context, spiritual context, philosophical context, then all of a sudden the dots make sense, right? So like Julie Dash's film, first time I saw it, I had no idea what she was doing. Not particularly with this clip, but in general, because it's not a very linear narrative. It's told from the perspective of a child who hasn't been born yet and all of this. So with the salt eaters, you have the African presence that I see in the text, if this is what you're asking, is the fact that there's references to the Loa, L-O-A, which are, the deities familiar in Voodoo cosmology. There is this whole concept of healing being at the center, healing being something which is being linked to the political struggle, that the main character is involved in, right? And the woman who's healing her is actively drawing on, the sort of her belief systems and the belief systems which have been passed down to her through this context to heal her, right? And it seems as if her ability to heal is kind of, on the one hand, about her coming to terms with crises that she faced in her life, which overwhelmed her, and then on the other hand, her recognizing and accepting that there's something else happening to her, which she may, have to figure out a way to deal with. I know I've seen it in Caribbean context, references to the fact that sometimes people go through a really long illness, frequently an illness where they might have come close to dying, and after they come out of the illness, they will come away from it with certain kinds of new gifts. Like some people suddenly will realize that they have a talent for painting. There's a woman that I know of, after in her late 50s, it was really, really sick, came out of it, and suddenly had this talent for painting. And there's always the association of the emergence of these kinds of powers with some kind of trauma